Okay, today we're talking about triangles, my favorite shape. First, we're going to classify triangles. We're going to group them into different categories. The first way that we classify triangles is by their angles. So, the three ways, actually there's 4 ways, but the 3 main ways that we classify a triangle based on its angle measures is acute, obtuse, or right. If your triangle has all 3 of its angles all measure less than 90 degrees, if all 3 angles are acute angles, we classify the triangle as acute. So all the angles have to be less than 90 degrees. If one of the angles is an obtuse angle, so if one angle is obtuse, more than 90 degrees, its measure is more than 90 degrees, greater than 90 degrees, then it's obtuse. So it'll have 2 acute angles, 1 obtuse angle. So all you need is, you just need 1 obtuse angle in order for it to be an obtuse triangle. You're actually only going to have 1 obtuse angle, and then the other 2 angles would be acute for it to be an obtuse triangle. And then finally, if your triangle has 1 right angle, one of its angles is 90 degrees, measures 90 degrees. If you just have 1 right angle, the other 2 will be acute angles. But if your triangle has 1 right angle, 1 angle that measures 90 degrees, or if you see this little box in the corner, then you say that that's a right triangle. Another way we can classify triangles is based on their side lengths. So an isosceles triangle has 2 sides, at least 2 sides are congruent. So in an isosceles triangle, at least 2 of its sides are going to be congruent to each other. So if you notice in this picture that 2 of the sides are marked with 2 of those little tick marks, those little dashes. So an isosceles triangle has 2 or more, at least 2 of its 3 sides are congruent to each other. An equilateral triangle has all 3 sides are congruent to each other. So if it's equilateral, all 3 of its sides are congruent. And then a scalene triangle has none of its sides congruent to each other. No sides congruent. So on a scalene triangle, you might see something like one side gets 1 tick mark, the other side gets 2 tick marks, and the third side gets 3 tick marks. So they all have different numbers of tick marks. These tick marks look kind of funky right here, but if they all have different numbers of tick marks, then they're all different lengths. So scalene, none of the sides are congruent to each other. Okay, a couple other things about isosceles and equilateral triangles. So on an isosceles triangle, if you have these 2 sides are congruent. Actually, I'm just gonna draw a triangle. If these 2 sides are congruent to each other, then the base angles are going to be congruent to each other. So an isosceles triangle has 2 sides and 2 angles that are congruent. So if I say this is triangle ABC, if I tell you segment AC is congruent to segment CB, then the base angles are congruent to each other. Then angle A is congruent to angle B. So it's a little tricky. It's the, if this is your side that's congruent, it's this angle and this angle that are congruent. So they're like across from the sides that are congruent. So if I had told you that these sides were congruent, then these angles would be congruent. That picture turned out terribly. So if I had told you like these sides were congruent, then it would be these angles that were congruent. If it had been these sides that were congruent, it would be these angles that were congruent. So it's like whichever sides are congruent, it's the base angles, the ones that are opposite from that side. The converse of this is true as well. If those base angles are congruent, then those sides are going to be congruent as well. So in an isosceles triangle, you have two pairs of sides that are congruent, and then you have the two base angles that are congruent. So sides and the angles. Sides, angles. Sides, angles. And an equilateral triangle, all of the sides are congruent to each other, and all of the angles are congruent to each other. And not only are all of the angles congruent to each other, they're all 60 degrees. In every equilateral triangle, all three angles are always going to be 60 degrees. Their measures will be 60 degrees. So in an equilateral triangle, the measure of each angle is going to be equal to 60 degrees. So an equilateral triangle not only has all three sides congruent, but it has all three angles congruent. So another word we can use to describe an equilateral triangle is it's equiangular. Angular meaning angles, equa meaning equal. All three angles are equal. All three angles are equal to 60 degrees. 60 degrees is an acute angle. So an equilateral triangle is equilateral. That's how we would classify it by its sides. And if we were to classify it by its angles, it would be acute, because all three of its angles are acute, and it would be equiangular. All three of its angles are congruent. So an equilateral triangle has several names that we can use to describe it.